Hey guys, tonight we're wandering through dusty villages and sacred temples, across silent marble floors and under neem trees buzzing with cicadas, all to uncover a forgotten world of ancient Indian board games that quietly set the stage for the global mega phenomenon we now call chess. You'll find yourself crouched in courtyards, surrounded by echoes of royalty and whispers of the divine, watching fingers flick cowrie shells and slide tokens carved from ivory and stone. The twist? These weren't just games. Sometimes they decided marriages, settled rivalries, or taught the spiritual meaning of life and loss. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive the rules of Ashtapada without a nap and a flowchart. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge barefoot through a dusty lane in the Indian subcontinent, somewhere around 2000 BCE. The air smells faintly of turmeric and wood smoke, and in the shade of a brick home, a group of children and elders huddle around what looks like a scuffed square drawn into the ground. At first glance, it's just marks in the dirt and a few pebbles, but you quickly realize it's a game. These earliest Indian games weren't mass-produced or marketed with flashy packaging. They didn't come with instruction manuals or character tokens molded in plastic. They lived in muscle memory, oral tradition, and imagination. The boards were dirt patches, the pieces were stones or nuts, and the rules morphed depending on the region, or whoever argued the loudest that day. Historians still argue whether these improvised pastimes were merely for fun or if they served deeper roles, training memory, sharpening strategy, or even acting as primitive ritual simulations. One mainstream theory is that many of these early board games evolved out of a need to pass the time during monsoons, when fields flooded and families huddled indoors for days. You spot a game that looks suspiciously like tic-tac-toe, except it's played with seeds and a spiral carved into the ground. A grandmother watches closely, occasionally intervening to correct a 6-year-old's move, muttering something about karma under her breath. Every now and then, a cow wanders too close and wipes the whole board out with a swish of its tail. Reset. You wouldn't find cardboard boxes or brand logos here, but the intent. Timeless. Compete, learn, bond, win, or at least accuse your cousin of cheating with dramatic flair. A particularly quirky tidbit. In some early Indian households, dried tamarind pods were used as dice substitutes, especially when metal was scarce or considered inauspicious during certain festivals. Imagine balancing the tension of fate on a shriveled piece of legume. Hardcore. Across town, you hear the slap of cowrie shells hitting polished stone. That sound will follow us through centuries, trust me. Cowries. Those glossy little seashells were everywhere, used as currency, divination tools, and game dice. Unlike cubic dice with numbered pips, cowrie shells fall in curved patterns that require interpretation. You don't just roll, you divine. As you squat beside a board scraped into a courtyard, you realize how communal these games were. There's no solo play here. Spectators yell advice, children heckle. One uncle has clearly had too much fermented coconut drink and is loudly accusing everyone of conspiracy. A faded mural on the temple wall nearby shows a deity, possibly Vishnu or Krishna, seated in eternal stillness, playing a game with a mortal. It's unclear who's winning, and that's probably the point. Even by 1000 BCE, games in India had moved from dirt patches to textile boards, stitched and dyed with care. You find one such board, a faded cotton square dyed with indigo, its edges embroidered with lotus patterns. It looks like a humble cloth, until the players start explaining the rules and your eyes glaze over in 30 seconds flat. Yet somehow, they remember everything. Game as ritual, game as story. Some say these early board games were used to reenact mythological battles or moral allegories. like live theater, just less shouting and more tokens. Archaeological finds from sites like Lothal and Mohenjo-Daro, yes, technically in present-day Pakistan, but part of the broader Indus Valley civilization, have yielded tiny game pieces, cuboid dice, conical tokens, and etched squares that suggest some form of grid-based play. One set of dice, oddly weighted, still has researchers squinting suspiciously. Accident, or ancient cheating tech. There's debate about how organized these early games were. Some scholars argue they had formalized rules, passed down orally. Others think they were spontaneous social inventions, like kids today making up new rules for just to see your eye twitch. As night falls and fireflies blink lazily in the dark, the game boards remain. Scratched into stone, etched in memory, or stitched into fading fabric, you lie back, head propped on your arm, listening to the soft laughter, the clack of shells, the occasional argument about who actually won. And somewhere deep in your bones, you start to understand this isn't just passing time. It's preserving time, embalming it in play. You shift positions on the cool stone floor, now seated near a small shrine, where incense coils drift lazily upward. In front of you, a group of men are gathered, half lit by the amber glow of a hanging oil lamp. They're throwing dice, real, tangible, clattering pieces of history, and discussing whether luck is a gift from the gods or a curse from your last bad decision. Welcome to the world of ancient Indian dice games, where play and fate get tangled like vines on a banyan tree. These aren't the standardized six-sided cubes you might be used to. The early Indian dice, known as a ka, were often oblong, with 4 marked sides, and sometimes made from ivory, wood, or bone. The cubical dice would come later, but even then, balance wasn't guaranteed. One quirky find from the Indus Valley shows a die with oddly distributed pips. Perhaps an early attempt at stacking the odds, or just the handiwork of someone who eyeballed the math. You pick one up. It's heavier than expected, cool to the touch, and etched with faint, nearly erased markings. A simple toss, but so much more than a game move. In the Rig Veda, one of the world's oldest texts, there's a whole hymn dedicated to dice. It's essentially the ancient version of someone begging their poker chips to behave. In it, the gambler laments his ruin at the hands of the dice, cursing their allure and begging to be free. This isn't Monopoly rage. This is spiritual level regret. Historians still argue whether these dice were originally used strictly for gaming, or if they first belonged to divination practices. Given their prevalence in religious literature and ritualistic contexts, the lines between sacred and secular were probably as blurred then as they are now when someone says they're just playing for fun, with real money on the line. But let's not get too lofty. Sometimes people just wanted to roll bones and win bragging rights, or goats. Yeah, livestock was sometimes a prize. In a village not far from the Ganges, you watch 2 farmers slap dice into a carved wooden tray, the loser obligated to give up a fat chicken. Honor is on the line. Also lunch. The great Indian epic Mahabharata is basically one long cautionary tale about dice. Prince Yudhishthira, noble and a bit too into his code of honor, agrees to a game of dice with his shady cousin Shakuni. Spoiler alert, Shakuni cheats, like it's his birthright. Using cursed dice, supposedly made from his own father's bones. Yes, that's the creepy part. He defeats Yudhishthira again and again. Lands, wealth, brothers, even Yudhishthira's wife Draupadi, all lost in one disastrous, very not PG-13 evening of rolling the bones. You sit beside a bard reciting the tale in sing-song rhythm, the firelight flickering across his animated face. A few listeners are clearly dozing, lulled by repetition and the warm night air. You're not far behind. The dice in this context were more than objects. They were tools of fate, trickery, moral testing grounds, and somehow still a game. The psychological gymnastics of calling a life, ruining wager play, is something only humans can manage with a straight face. A lesser known tidbit. Some ancient Indian dice sets used black dots for odd numbers and red ones for even. The symbolic split had numerological significance, tied to dualities like good vs evil, male vs female, day vs night. So, every roll was a kind of cosmological statement, whether you meant it or not. You thought you were just gambling for mangoes, but apparently you were reenacting the eternal dance of light and shadow. As the hours tick by, the crowd thins. Only 2 players remain, and their game has turned silent, serious. No more cheering. Just breathless watching. You can feel the energy shift. The way tension coils in moments of uncertainty, how the clack of dice echoes louder. Now that the stakes are higher, you find yourself reflecting. These early dice games weren't about mindless entertainment. They were confrontations with chaos. Practicing how to lose gracefully. Testing one's ability to maintain inner peace when the shell lands wrong side. Up for the 5th time in a row. Back at the temple, a monk teaches a novice to play using stones and hand gestures alone. No physical board. The goal isn't to win. It's to become mindful of patterns, outcomes, and attachment. It's like Zen chess, but even slower and with a decent chance of being interrupted by a peacock. By the time you drift into half, sleep, the dice games continue in your peripheral hearing. Soft rolls, soft gasps, the murmurs of fate shifting in tiny plastic-sounding clatters. You feel a strange respect for these unassuming little objects. They've rolled through time, changing lives, invoking gods, ruining dinners. And now, finally, lulling you to sleep. You rub your eyes as the morning sun streams through an open courtyard, and suddenly you're transported to the golden age of Indian board gaming, the reign of Pachisi. And no, that's not a sneeze. It's a game. Possibly the game. Invented over 1,000 years ago, Pachisi isn't just a forerunner of modern Ludo. It was once the high-stakes darling of India's royal courts. You'll be dodging flying cowrie shells and royal side, eye for the next 1,000 words. Pachisi, often dubbed the national game of India, is played on a cross-shaped board, traditionally made of cloth and embroidered with vibrant threads. You kneel beside a board dyed in deep reds and indigos, spread across cool marble. Around you, nobles in silk sit with a calculated nonchalance, like poker players pretending they're not emotionally attached to the outcome. Each arm of the cross represents a path, and the center is the goal. Home base. You control 4 pieces, and the aim is to circle the board and return them safely. Sounds simple. It's not. Because the game isn't just about movement, it's about betrayal, blockades, and some seriously unspoken vendettas. Cowrie shells serve as dice, thrown dramatically into a shallow bowl with flair worthy of a Vegas croupier. Depending on how many land opening, up versus down, you move your pieces a corresponding number of spaces. There's even a special rule: if all 4 shells land open, side up, you get a lucky 25. Yep, Pachisi literally means 5. Historians still argue whether the game originated in monasteries as a meditative tool or evolved from street play into elite competition. Some suggest it began as a method for teaching the 4 stages of human life in Hindu philosophy: student, householder, hermit, and renunciate. But then again, maybe people just liked shouting at each other over cowrie shells. A famous and oddly theatrical historical fact: the Mughal emperor Akbar loved Pachisi so much, he commissioned a life-size version of the board in his palace at Fatehpur Sikri. Instead of tokens, he used real people dressed in colored robes, moving according to the results of a massive cowrie toss. That's right, human chess pieces, reality TV style 16th century edition. Can you imagine explaining that on Honorary Sume? Former red token, Emperor Akbar's right path, 1586 to 1589. You wander through that same palace, the massive board still visible in the courtyard stone. Birds flit through the arches, as you imagine nobles watching from balconies, sipping rosewater and placing wagers. The stone glints under the sun, and suddenly you realize this wasn't just leisure, it was spectacle, performance. A blend of theater, politics, and passive-aggressive social warfare. Quirky tidbit: Some versions of the game required players to recite a verse or answer a riddle after each move. A wrong answer. You lose your turn. Imagine Ludo crossed with trivia night at a Sanskrit poetry club. One elderly noblewoman gestures for you to sit beside her and play. She smiles with that terrifying calm of someone who's won hundreds of games and forgotten none of them. You think you're doing okay until she traps your last piece on a junction square and smirks like a Bond villain. As you struggle to re-enter the board, you notice how deeply the game reflects real life, especially in the subtle alliances and betrayals. Players gang up, then split. Strategies change based on who's ahead. A simple move can backfire dramatically. Pachisi isn't just turn-based movement. It's social commentary in disguise. It's also a tactile experience. The flick of shells, the smoothness of the polished tokens, the frayed cloth edges beneath your fingers. You're not pressing buttons. You're part of something ancient, intimate, and oddly philosophical. One modern theory even suggests that the layout of the Pachisi board, with its four arms and central square, mirrors the mandala, a sacred diagram in Hindu and Buddhist traditions representing the universe. So yes, your cousin knocking your piece back to start might be karmically significant. A temple bell rings in the distance, and the players pause not to pray, but to argue over whether a shell counted as open if it landed sideways. A heated debate ensues. One player cites a precedent from his grandfather's game in 1943. You stay silent wisely. There are no rule books here, just memory, ego, and whoever speaks the loudest. Eventually, your piece makes it home. You're not the first to finish, but at least you're not last. You get a soft pat on the back from the noblewoman, her version of knighting you. You smile, and for a brief second, you feel the centuries slip away. Later that night, you return to that same cloth board, now deserted under the moonlight. You trace the faded threads with your finger, and imagine how many hands, hopes, and histories have passed through this exact spot. Pachisi may seem simple, but it's the kind of game that gets into your bloodstream. A game of fate, strategy, and the occasional petty grudge. You roll a few shells yourself before sleep takes over. 3 face up, 1 down. Move cautiously, traveler. You wake up to the rhythmic clang of temple bells and the distant chatter of marketplace vendors. But your attention is drawn not to the smells of hot ghee and cardamom, but to a vibrant square of cloth laid across a low stone platform. The game today is Chopper, Pachisi's more intense, older cousin. Part game, part holy reckoning, part psychological warfare. At first glance, Chopper looks familiar. The cross-shaped board, the 4 sets of tokens, and cowrie shells for dice. It's clearly a relative of Pachisi. But when you sit down beside the players, you quickly sense a shift in energy. This isn't courtly leisure anymore. Chopper is heavier, metaphorically, and sometimes literally. If Pachisi is a royal pastime, Chopper is its battle-hardened ancestor. Historians still argue whether Chopper predates Pachisi or developed alongside it as a kind of parallel evolution in different regions. Some claim it originated among warrior classes and monks, while others say it was simply a regional variation. What is clear, though, is that Chopper was serious business. It had rules. It had nuance. It had grudges that outlived empires. The players you join are men in saffron robes, pilgrims on break from their journey, or maybe ascetics passing time. One of them invites you to play, his smile half challenge, half benediction. You sit, and the shells are tossed. A key difference from Pachisi, the number of cowries. Chopper usually uses 7, not 4, and each combination maps to a different movement value. This adds complexity, and yes, more opportunity for creative arguing. You hear the familiar murmur, "That doesn't count. It counted yesterday. Yesterday we weren't in Kashi." Your fingers fumble with your token, hand, carved wood, worn at the edges, and your first move feels oddly momentous. Because Chopper isn't just a race to the finish. It's about tactically blocking opponents, capturing them, and forcing them to restart, again and again. The tension ratchets up quickly, and just like in the Mahabharata, which prominently features this very game, losing isn't just a personal failure. It's a cosmic drama. Remember Yudhishthira, the noble but unlucky prince? He plays chopper with the cheating Shakuni and loses everything. His kingdom, his brothers, even his dignity. It's not subtle symbolism. Chopper becomes a microcosm of dharma, fate, temptation, and downfall. The dice are cursed. The stakes are moral. The result? A war that ends in age. Some versions of the Mahabharata even say Shakuni's dice were made from the bones of his dead father, infused with dark magic. Fringe theory? Absolutely. But compelling. Especially if your opponent is winning way too easily and gives you a knowing wink. Quirky fact for the day. Some regional chopper boards had custom-made dice cups, small animal horns, or coconut shells, hollowed out and polished, to roll the cowries. One particularly ornate example found in Rajasthan is inlaid with silver, because apparently nothing says strategic humility like bedazzled equipment. Your opponent eyes you calmly, his fingers steepled. You realize he hasn't moved a piece in 10 minutes. He's watching, calculating. Chopper allows players to pass, to wait, to bait. Unlike Pachisi, patience is part of the strategy. You've entered a slow, motion battlefield. You take another move, cautiously, and suddenly your opponent lunges. Metaphorically, of course. He captures your piece. Back to start. The other players nod in approval. You learn quickly that Chopper rewards ruthlessness wrapped in humility. It's not personal, it's spiritual. One scholar beside the game board leans in to share an open debate whether Chopper began as a monastic practice to teach self-control and detachment. Losing pieces, watching them get captured, surrendering progress, all metaphors for the impermanence of life. Or, just a really frustrating Tuesday night activity for ascetics with too much free time. The more you play, the more the rhythm of the game pulls you in. There's a hypnotic quality to it. The cyclical nature, the dance of shells, the procession of wooden tokens around the board. No flashy graphics, no winner confetti, just silence, strategy, and the occasional disapproving grunt. As dusk approaches, one of the players begins to chant softly while waiting for his turn. The game slows. It becomes less about winning and more about the flow. Moves are no longer reactions. They're decisions layered with intent. You begin to see why this game was passed down for generations, not just as play, but as practice, as a form of mental training. By now, your token is close to home, and your opponents seem amused by your cautious optimism. One last throw. You need a specific combination. The shells fly. 4 face up, 3 down. You land exactly where you need to be. You look up, expecting celebration. Instead, the monk across from you simply nods. No applause. No gloating. You finish, yes? But that's not the lesson. You sit there a moment longer, staring at the worn cloth, the tokens returning to their pouches, the shells being gathered reverently into a copper bowl. The game is over, but the echoes remain, like footsteps on temple stone, like whispered prayers caught in wind. Chopar didn't just teach you strategy, it taught you silence. You blink awake to the sound of children laughing and the thump, thump, thump of something sliding across a board. But this time, the vibe's completely different. Gone are the whispers of noble betrayal and monkish strategy. Now, you're in the bright daylight of morality, karma, and the world's most didactic game. Snakes and ladders. Yes, really. That harmless little game tucked inside kindergarten cabinets and rainy day closets. It began as a powerful spiritual journey in ancient India. And back then, winning wasn't just a matter of luck. It was enlightenment. You're seated beneath a banyan tree in a temple courtyard. A cloth board is spread out, painted with vibrant squares, each one containing a small illustration. Some show figures meditating, others depict acts of violence, theft, or, oddly enough, a guy refusing to help his neighbor carry water. That's a snake square, the goal of the game. Reach moksha, the state of liberation from the cycle of rebirth. In other words, This is less about beating your cousin and more about transcending existence itself. No pressure. This original version was called Mokshapadam, and it dates back to around the 2nd century BCE, though versions varied wildly by region. Players roll dice, yes, our old friend again, and move their token from the bottom, left corner of the grid, up through the squares toward salvation. But it's not just about upward movement. Along the way, you hit ladders representing virtues like faith, generosity, and truth. Land on one of these, and you leap closer to enlightenment. But step on a snake, symbolizing lust, anger, greed, or ego, and whoosh, you're sliding back down. Like a moral game of chutes and ladders, but with a lot more Sanskrit and cosmic accountability. One mainstream historical fact: the game was used by Jain and Hindu teachers as a fun but sobering way to teach children about karma and ethical living. The message was clear. Your actions have consequences, and shortcuts to goodness are rare. But oh, the snakes are many and well fed. Historians still argue whether this game was actually designed for children or for novice monks. Some point to the detailed, allegorical art on ancient versions, which would go over the average kid's head faster than a ladder on square 17. Others suggest that its simplicity was the whole point. Spiritual truths made digestible through play. Your eyes scan the board, and it's not just morality tales painted in ink. Some squares include subtle references to Indian cosmology, Mount Meru, the Wheel of Samsara, even metaphorical demons from myth. You land on one labeled Pride. A snake coils around your piece and drags it back to attachment. You feel that, a quirky detail. One ancient variant of the game featured 72 squares and exactly 9 ladders and 18 snakes, intentionally unbalanced to represent how hard it is to progress spiritually versus how easy it is to fall back into bad habits. You could say the game was rigged by the universe itself. A monk nearby chuckles softly and says, "Only the pure-hearted reach square 72. You suspect he's also playing mind games. The original boards were hand-painted on cloth or wood, often passed down through generations. Over time, these gave way to printed versions under British colonial rule. Of course, when the British took the game back home, they stripped out the spiritual elements, added some goofy ladders and grinning snakes, and turned it into a cheerful game of random chance. Because nothing screams Victorian fun like ignoring karma. But you're still here, cross-legged under the tree, watching the children around you argue over the fairness of one kid, leaping 4 rows up thanks to generosity, while another sobs because jealousy knocked her from square 68 all the way down to 12. It's brutal, it's beautiful, it's life. You take your own turn. Land on detachment, ladder. You rise up several rows, then Lazarus, snake, down you go. At some point, you realize you're no longer rooting to win. You're just appreciating the metaphor. Every rise and fall feels familiar. Somewhere near the end of the board, square 71 glows slightly in the late afternoon sun. It's labeled wisdom. But the final square, 72, is blank, completely empty. The monk explains true liberation cannot be described, only experienced. You nod like you understand, but your brain is still stuck on how unfair that snake on ego was. Eventually, someone wins. The monk announces the token has reached moksha. Everyone claps, then immediately resets the board to start again. Because that's the thing, isn't it? Even if you win the game, there's always another round waiting in some other life, or classroom, or temple courtyard. You lie back on the stone tiles, gazing up at a sky scattered with thin clouds. The children play on. The monk rolls the dice for the next student. A breeze rustles the banyan leaves, and you, now thoroughly snake-bitten and ladder-lifted, can't help but smile. Because for a simple game, this one packs a universe of meaning between its painted squares. The next morning is cooler, quieter. You walk a narrow stone path through misty temple gardens and enter a shaded chamber, where a group of monks sit around a grid etched faintly into the stone floor. No bright colors, no kauris, Just soft chants and a deep, almost mathematical calm. You've arrived at Ashtapada, a board game so old, so understated, it almost dares you to overlook it. The name, Ashtapada, literally means 8 steps, referring to the 8x8 square grid that makes up the board. Yes, 8 by 8. Sounds familiar. That's because Ashtapada is often cited as one of the earliest ancestors of the modern chessboard. But don't expect knights and rooks galloping across the surface. Ashtapada was something entirely different, yet foundational. Historians still argue whether Ashtapada was a single game or a format for many. The grid served as a flexible playing surface, and the rules varied dramatically depending on region, teacher, or spiritual intention. Some versions were race games, similar to Pachisi, others were strategy-based. But what made Ashtapada unique was its austerity. No decorations, no painted figures. Just stark lines, like a monastic Sudoku waiting to become something else. You squat near one of the monks, and he gently offers you a worn ivory piece. A simple cylinder. He motions for you to place it on the board. There's no dramatic cowrie toss here. Instead, you and your fellow players move according to a predetermined set of roles, using knucklebones or numbered dice. Some moves are obvious. Others require an understanding of patterns so obscure. You're fairly certain this is part game, part intelligence test, part sleep trap. Quirky fact, certain squares on early Ashtapada boards were marked with symbols, lotus flowers, crosses, or tiny animal figures, believed to be special zones. Some scholars call them castle squares. In some versions, landing on one granted immunity from capture. In others, it trapped you. Good luck remembering which was which. You try to follow the game. It's hard. There's almost no talking. Just movements, quiet calculations, and the occasional deep, It's as if this isn't a game at all, but a contemplative exercise wearing the disguise of leisure. A bald monk leans in and whispers, Ashtapada is not about victory. It is about pattern. You smile and nod like you get it. You do not. As the hours stretch, you realize this game is a kind of meditation. Each move requires total focus. Each square demands awareness. The monk's eyes flick from the board to the ceiling and back again, as if he's aligning something cosmic. One mainstream historical fact, Ashtapada boards have been found carved into temple steps and monastic floors, suggesting it was a daily part of spiritual life. Unlike other board games that migrated across caste lines and marketplaces, Ashtapada stayed in the quiet, sacred corners of society. You start to notice the rhythm, observe, wait, move. It's like breathing. No fanfare, no ladders or snakes, just decisions, ripples, cause and effect. It's like someone tried to turn philosophy into a pastime, and the result was this grid of mysterious minimalism. At some point, a young novice tries to explain the variant they're playing. It involves pairs of pieces moving in concert, trying to trap a third. It sounds straightforward until the third piece moves in a pattern no one seems able to explain. You give up trying to win and instead just mimic what the monk to your left does. He seems wise, also undefeated. One lovely tidbit, some ancient Ashtapada sets doubled as teaching tools for arithmetic and astrology. The grid was used not only for play, but also to plot planetary paths or teach multiplication. Talk about multi-purpose living. Your chessboard could also tell your horoscope. As the sun moves higher, the game ends without any celebration. Pieces are gathered. The board is wiped clean with a damp cloth. No one announces a winner. You're not even sure there was one. Instead, the players bow to each other. The oldest monk smiles at you. The board teaches, he says. You follow them into the temple garden, stepping quietly past rows of fragrant jasmine. Your mind is oddly calm, not just from the game, but from how stripped down it was. No fluff, no distraction, just space, decisions, and stillness. It lingers. Ashtapada doesn't stick in your memory like a story. It haunts it like a pattern you almost understood. The kind of game that follows you, gently, reminding you that movement doesn't always mean progress. That silence is a kind of victory. that sometimes the board is the teacher and you are merely passing through its lessons. You shake off the quiet trance of Ashtapada and find yourself on the edge of a battlefield. Not the real kind, though the energy is strangely similar. This board is different. The lines are crisp. The pieces more defined. You've arrived in the heart of strategy, hierarchy, and empire building Chaturanga, the game that many scholars believe laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern chess. It's the Gupta Empire, somewhere around the 6th century CE. You're seated on a low wooden stool beside a military commander, his fingers stained with ink and sandalwood, his eyes laser, focused on the board between you. The name Chaturanga translates to 4 limbs, referring to the 4 divisions of the ancient Indian army: elephants, cavalry, chariots, and infantry. And yes, you're about to command them all. The board is familiar, 8x8 squares, just like Ashtapada, but this time, there's structure. Each player controls pieces that mimic military units: the Gajas elephant, Ashvas horse, Rathas chariot, and Padatas' foot soldier. There's also a mantri, minister, and a Rajas king, seated squarely in the center, surrounded like a monarch in a fortress. You move your pieces cautiously, uncertain of their paths. The rules are slightly different from modern chess. Elephants move diagonally 2 squares at a time, horses in that familiar L shape, and chariots like rooks. The minister, awkward and limited, moving only 1 square diagonally, a far cry from today's queen. The king can move 1 square in any direction, but has no option to castle. And no, checkmate isn't even called that yet. Historians still argue whether Chaturanga evolved directly from Ashtapada or was an entirely new creation meant to simulate real war for educational or entertainment purposes. Some posit it was designed to train royal heirs in decision-making. Others say it was just a particularly nerdy monk's way of livening up monastic afternoons. A mainstream historical fact, Chaturanga is one of the earliest known games to feature multiple types of pieces with distinct movement patterns. A revolutionary step in gaming history. It introduced asymmetry and long-term planning, paving the way for every strategy game that followed. Your fellow player, retired soldier with a long mustache and a long memory, leans in and captures your horse. Should have flanked left, he mutters. You nod gravely, pretending you knew that. The game continues slowly, deliberately. Unlike faster games of chance, Chaturanga forces you to think several moves ahead. It's like watching a temple dance, elegant, structured, and loaded with meaning. And like real warfare, victory is never just about numbers. It's about anticipation, bluffing, reading your opponent. A quirky historical tidbit. Some regional versions of Chaturanga were played with 4 players in teams of 2, using dice to determine which piece could move on each turn. This chaotic version was probably more popular at festivals and drunken feasts, because nothing says divine strategy like a random number generator. You're getting the hang of it now. You advance your elephant, who, by the way, is a tricky little beast, limited in mobility, but symbolic of wisdom and royal might. He gets cornered almost immediately. Your minister attempts a diagonal rescue and is promptly taken. You're losing, elegantly, with style. As the final moves play out, you start to see the design logic. This isn't just about capturing a piece, it's about weakening an ecosystem. Removing a chariot might not be as dramatic as capturing the king, but it leaves your flanks exposed. The game mirrors the real structures of court and combat. The pieces aren't abstract shapes. They're extensions of political and military life. You stare at the board and imagine it in a campaign tent, with generals strategizing over positions, testing out scenarios before committing to actual bloodshed. It's both sobering and impressive how humans have always used games to model life, death, and power. Eventually, your king is trapped, not captured, because in Chaturanga, there's no official rule for checkmate as we know it. Instead, your opponent declares Stanapada, meaning something like, position is lost. You nod and concede, You leave the table with that oddly pleasant sense of defeat, because every mistake was yours and every success was earned. The board is reset. A new game begins between two others. The cycle continues. And in this dusty, sun-drenched courtyard, it's easy to see how Chaturanga could travel across borders and centuries, mutating gently into something grander. Into Shatranj. Into chess. But we're not there yet. For now, you brush sand from your knees and glance back at the board one more time. The Raja, still sitting proud. The elephant, waiting for orders. The battlefield frozen in thought. It's not just a game, it's a rehearsal for everything. As twilight stains the sky with strokes of orange and amethyst, you find yourself crossing a border. Not in geography, but in time and culture. Chaturanga is dissolving, reshaped by merchants and empires. You follow the game into Persia, where it evolves and adopts a new name, a new language, and a few extra rules. Welcome to Shatranj, where strategy gets poetic and pawns start growing mustaches. You sit cross-legged on a finely woven carpet inside a modest home in Ctesiphon, capital of the Sasanian Empire. The fragrance of spiced dates and cardamom tea wafts from the corner. Two scholars sit before a board of deep green and cream colored squares. Their conversation is light, but their game is deadly serious. This is no idle pastime. This is Shatranj. The transition from Chaturanga to Shatranj isn't just a linguistic twist. It's a cultural transformation. The Persians embrace the Indian game with gusto, adapting it to their own poetic, mathematical, and bureaucratic sensibilities. The names change. Raja becomes Shah's king, Mantri becomes vizier, a piece later transformed into the modern queen, Ashva becomes Ferris' horse, and Gaja becomes Phil's elephant. The Ratha, that's now a rook. Yes, that's where rook comes from. One mainstream historical fact, Shatranj preserved the board and basic concept of Chaturanga, but the piece movements became more constrained. The elephant, for instance, could now only move 2 diagonal spaces, leapfrogging over the middle. The vizier moved only 1 square diagonally, a far cry from today's power queen. The game was slower, more calculated, and deeply cerebral. You quickly notice the pace. Each move is considered, discussed, and sometimes written down. Players pause to recite poetry, reference scholars, or sip tea. It's all very refined until someone captures a vizier and murmurs, Shah, the Persian cry meaning, King. Your opponent is in check. The board just got real. Historians still argue whether the rules of Shatranj were codified for uniformity, or if regional variants were common. Some ancient manuscripts describe wildly different setups, including boards shaped like crosses or circles. Others suggest that competitive play, yes, tournaments existed, demanded a kind of rule standardization long before FIFA got involved. You lean closer to the board and realize something charmingly specific. The pieces are not mere markers. They're carved. The horse has a mane. The elephant has tusks. The vizier has a stern, pointed beard. In some versions, the pawns have tiny turbans or military caps. A quirky little detail. One recovered set from the Abbasid Caliphate era includes pawns with actual mustaches etched into them. Because nothing says loyalty like facial hair, you take a tentative turn under a scholar's guidance, moving your fils. Elephant feels more like positioning a bishop with a limp. The game's reduced movement options make it defensive, less about ambushes, and more about long sieges. It's like playing chess underwater, with weighted robes and a scroll of Rumi tucked into your belt. And then comes a phrase you recognize from 1,000 movies and cartoons. Shahmat, checkmate. Literally, the king is helpless. That's where our modern checkmate comes from. No loud victory cry, no dance. Just a serene declaration of inevitable loss. The defeated player bows slightly and recites a verse. Even kings, when cornered by truth, must bow. That's cold. Elegant but cold. A curious twist of fate. As Shatranj spread through Persia and into the Arab world, it took on the weight of scholarly prestige. Caliphs sponsored chess scholars. Books were written, not just about the game's rules, but about strategy, philosophy, and recorded matches between great minds. It became the game of thinkers, the preferred pastime of poets and mathematicians alike. Some Islamic scholars saw in Shatranj a microcosm of life and governance. The pieces represented not just military power, but balance, cooperation, and hierarchy. You could be a pawn, but with effort and position, you might promote. Social commentary, wrapped in camel bone and sandalwood. But not everyone approved. Certain religious authorities frowned on the game's association with gambling and idleness. For a brief time, playing chess, like games, was even banned in some parts of the Islamic world. The ban didn't last. People just got sneakier, or more poetic in how they described the rules. As the game ends and the pieces are packed away into a velvet pouch, you find yourself surprised by how intimate it felt. Slower than Chaturanga, less theatrical than Pachisi, but deeper somehow. Like walking through a quiet, ancient library of movement and meaning. Your host places a hand on your shoulder and says, "In Shatranj, the board is not where you win. It's where you are revealed." You step out into the evening air, the stars emerging one by one. The journey of the game isn't over. It's just begun. But from this Persian crossroad, you can already feel the gravity pulling westward. Toward Europe. Toward evolution. But not before a few more stops along the way. Morning light filters through a lattice window carved with the shape of lotus petals, and you find yourself somewhere altogether grander. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine lingers in the air. You're inside a palace, a place where board games are not just games but rituals, performances, even flirtations. Today, the echoes of laughter and the rattle of dice guide you into the opulent domain of royal games and temple playgrounds. You follow the sound to an open veranda shaded by silk canopies. A group of women sit legged around a Pachisi board stitched onto golden silk. Their saris glimmer like gemstones. One tosses a handful of cowrie shells with a practiced flick, and the others gasp and giggle in a perfect choreography of anticipation and mock outrage. Board games here are everywhere. In palaces like this one, they're woven into the daily rhythm. Strategic contests between queens, companions, and sometimes visiting nobles. No one's raising an army here, but you'd be mistaken to call it trivial. These games are displays of intellect, charm, and status. Lose too often, and you risk social embarrassment. Win too often, and you'd better do it gracefully. A mainstream historical fact during the Mughal period, games like Pachisi and Gayan Chopper, the spiritual version of snakes and ladders, were standard pastimes in royal courts, especially among women. The games weren't just distractions, they were subtle tools for cultivating patience, wit, and even diplomacy. Historians still argue whether these games were truly inclusive, or if they were yet another arena for reinforcing hierarchy. While royal women played on boards of silk and ivory, servants and commoners used chalk on stone or threadbare cloth. Still, the shared language of play blurred lines now and then, when a maid beat her mistress, or when a board prince joined a courtyard game with the cooks. As you walk further into the palace, you find a special room, open to the sky, inlaid with marble and floral patterns. At the center is a life-sized game board carved into the floor. You recognize the layout, a version of Chowpar. Here, humans are the tokens, wearing color, coded robes, and waiting for a player to issue a command. Yes, it's real again, just like in Akbar's palace. One quirky tidbit, in southern temples, certain festivals included full-scale reenactments of board games, using dancers as pieces, choreographed to traditional music. You'd move across a board, not with dice, but with beats. Imagine square dancing mixed with moral philosophy. You head toward a temple courtyard, where monks are playing Gyan Chopper. The snakes are painted as demons, the ladders as ascetics. It's eerily quiet. Each roll of the dice carries metaphysical implications. A novice lands on envy and slides back 3 rows. The others nod solemnly. Lesson absorbed. Children peek from behind pillars, watching the game and mouthing the square names like prayers. Truth, Devotion. Deceit. These aren't just tokens, they're mirrors. Inside the temple sanctum, a priest shows you an ancient board painted onto a wooden panel. He explains that in some traditions, playing a game before a ritual was meant to center the mind. It represented the soul's journey through illusion toward enlightenment. A spiritual dress rehearsal, played in the quiet glow of butter lamps. The board games even sneak into sacred architecture. You spot faint carvings of Pachisi layouts on the steps of temple ghats, places where people bathe, pray, and die. Some scholars argue these were impromptu boards for pilgrims to play while waiting for rituals. Others believe they were symbolic maps of the spiritual path, games as metaphors etched in stone. Back in the palace, the midday heat sends everyone indoors. A group of young men crowd around a low table, playing a more aggressive variant of Chopper. A gold coin gleams in the center. It's a friendly wager, but the tension says otherwise. You sit nearby and sip a chilled rose drink. The stakes are emotional, not financial. Win, and you rise in the social micro ladder. Lose, and you retreat into anonymity. One of the players smiles at you, then captures an opponent's piece with theatrical flair. The room erupts in laughter, jeers, and a flurry of accusations. It's courtly drama distilled into a game, like a Jane Austen novel rewritten by the Mahabharata. And still, the games continue. In hidden chambers, temple porches, and marble courtyards. They mark time. They shape memory. They soothe minds and stir rivalries. As evening descends, you walk past a painted alcove depicting Krishna and Radha playing a board game. Their eyes lock mid-move, the dice forgotten. You realize that in this culture, a board game is never just a board game. It's a stage for intellect, a mirror for the soul, and sometimes, a backdrop for divine flirtation. The boards are folded away. The karis return to silk pouches. The laughter fades to murmurs. But even as you leave, you know the games will start again tomorrow, with the same players, different outcomes, and that same quiet pulse of ancient joy echoing beneath every square. You rise early the next morning and follow a winding path that takes you beyond royal palaces and temple steps. The atmosphere shifts. The air feels more still, more focused. You're heading toward a different kind of arena. One where board games aren't merely amusement or spiritual metaphor, but subtle instruments of influence, training, and persuasion. Welcome to the quiet intersection of games as meditation and manipulation. You enter a modest monastic complex nestled among tamarind trees. A group of monks sit in a circle around a board that looks familiar. But the energy is entirely different. No boasts, no bets, no laughter. Just breath, silence, and an occasional tap as a piece moves from one square to another. Here, board games are more than play. They are tools of discipline. The monks are playing a version of Ashtapada, but not competitively. Each player meditates before their turn, eyes closed, breathing slow. The object is not to win, but to stay present through the game's rhythms. This is chess by way of Zen garden. One mainstream historical fact: Buddhist monasteries and Hindu ashrams across ancient India often used board games like Gyan Chapar and Ashtapada as teaching tools. They weren't just about rules. They were about restraint, reflection, and observing how the mind reacts to loss and success. You notice something different about the pieces here. They're not ornate. Each one is identical. Cylindrical pegs with no distinguishing color or shape. You realize if you can't tell the pieces apart, you have to remember where everything is. The game becomes an exercise in mental mapping. A monk whispers, "Memory is the first wall between ignorance and wisdom." You take a turn, fumbling slightly. The monk beside you nods. "Mistakes are part of the move," he says. "Not comforting, but fair." Then the scene changes. You leave the monastery and walk into the inner sanctum of a royal advisor's chamber. The setting is elegant but severe. Polished wood, scrolls, low cushions. Two aristocrats are hunched over a chessboard, but the atmosphere is icy. One wrong move here, and someone might lose more than a pawn. Welcome to the manipulative side of board games. While monks used them for insight, rulers and diplomats used them to test character, loyalty, and even allegiance. In some royal courts, a player's game strategy was watched closely, not just for skill, but for signs of aggression, risk aversion, or hidden defiance. Historians still argue whether these matches were just training exercises or if they functioned like psychological evaluations. Playful on the surface, diagnostic beneath. Did that noblewoman sacrifice her rook too quickly? Was that servant's bishop maneuver a little too clever? A quirky tidbit, in certain medieval courts, young princes weren't considered ready for military responsibility until they could defeat their tutor in at least 3 consecutive games of chaturanga. Win or wait? No pressure, Your Highness. You observe a particularly intense game where one player keeps moving the same pawn forward, ignoring strategy. The room stiffens. A whisper, signaling defiance. You blink. Apparently, repetitive pawn moves were a known way to express disagreement or stall negotiation in courtly circles. At the far end of the room, a scroll unfurls, revealing game boards accompanied by proverbs. He who loses with grace gains respect. The longest game is played with silence. When the king is safe, the board is a mirror. It's clear now. This is part diplomacy, part theater, and part power play. Later, in a village meeting house, you watch an elder mediate a land dispute using a game board. Each player controls tokens representing different parts of the property. They reenact the land's use, simulating seasons, floods, and planting cycles. It's less about rules and more about representation. A dramatization of shared reality. A local explains. It helps them see each other's moves. Literally, you watch as 2 farmers, formerly scowling, begin to nod and adjust their tokens. The game becomes common ground, a way to move through disagreement without raising voices. By dusk, you sit alone with a small board of your own. You roll cowrie shells softly and move pieces in the fading light. You're not trying to win. You're just observing how it feels to plan, to lose, to pause. The way the board pushes you to notice your tendencies, to act too soon, to cling to lost causes, to resist restarting. And suddenly, it makes sense. These games were never just diversions. They were maps of minds, of intentions, of possible futures. A king could use them to spot rebellion. A monk could use them to transcend ego. A child could use them to understand patience. You trace your finger along the edge of the board, and the pieces blur into shadows. Not every move needs to be made. Sometimes, just sitting with the board is enough. You stretch your legs and feel the terrain shift again. The surroundings are unfamiliar. Uniforms instead of saris, clipboards instead of cowrie shells. You've landed smack in the middle of the 18th century, a period of cultural collision and cataloging. This is the era of colonial eyes on colored grids, where British officers, missionaries, and scholars stumble into the world of Indian board games, like kids at a magic show, frantically trying to write everything down before the enchantment disappears. You're in a sun-drenched British cantonment, seated awkwardly beside a tea table set with pachisi boards and unfinished notes. A young officer furrows his brow as a local artisan explains, again, how the cowrie values add up to 25 only when all face open side up. The officer repeats the numbers slowly, pencil scratching on parchment. You get the sense he still doesn't get it. These early British encounters with Indian games weren't always respectful or accurate. To many colonizers, pachisi was a native curiosity, a thing to be documented, tamed, possibly improved. You overhear someone mutter, "Perhaps we could make it simpler." Ah yes, the famous colonial instinct rearranged the board until it fits inside the empire. One mainstream historical fact. The British did, in fact, adapt pachisi into what we now call Ludo. Patented in England in 1896, the new version replaced cowries with a die, cloth with cardboard, and cultural layers with bright colors. It was colonialism's tidy packaging of ancient complexity into a fun family game. Historians still argue whether this simplification help preserve or dilute the original game. On one hand, it spread globally. On the other, it lost its spiritual, philosophical, and social dimensions. Ludo became mass market entertainment, and the ancestral board it came from faded into folklore. You walk through a colonial museum where Pachisi boards are pinned behind glass, like butterflies. Labels describe them as native amusements, often misnamed or mistranslated. The artistry is noted, but not the rules. The pieces are beautiful, but static. It feels like a story interrupted mid-sentence. And yet, not all colonial accounts were dismissive. Some British scholars were genuinely intrigued. You find pages from a missionary's journal filled with diagrams of snakes and ladders, labeled The Hindu Game of Moral Ascent. He marvels at the alignment with Christian ethics, noting how virtues lead up and sins pull down. You suspect he missed the part about karma and samsara, but points for effort. A quirky historical tidbit. One East India Company officer became so obsessed with Chopper that he commissioned a marble version of the board and held weekly matches with local pundits. When he lost, he reportedly fasted for a day. His letters home called it a most infuriating pastime that reveals my true character more than war ever could. In a classroom in Calcutta, a British teacher introduces Gian Chopper to a group of Indian students as a tool for moral instruction. The children nod politely, then proceed to change half the rules the moment he's not looking. One whispers, "We make our own ladders." You smile. Meanwhile, Indian nobility played their own role in bridging the cultural gap. Some princely courts hosted game nights specifically for colonial guests, using them as soft diplomacy. A game of Pachisi could build rapport or test it. Lose gracefully, and you were seen as fair. Win too often, and you risked bruising egos. One Raja famously allowed a visiting governor to win a match, then sent him aboard the next morning with a single note, "Let's see how you do without help." You observe a group of British wives learning snakes and ladders from a temple priest. The priest explains the meanings behind the squares: greed, humility, deception, enlightenment. One woman asks why there are more snakes than ladders. The priest shrugs. Such is life. Back in the drawing room, a new variant is being drawn. Less symbolism, more competition. No ladders labeled faith or meditation. Just numbers. The soul of the game, like many other cultural artifacts, is being repackaged for export. And yet, the originals persist. In alleyways, courtyards, and village gatherings, the classic boards still appear, chalked onto stone, drawn in sand, painted onto fabric. While the British fiddle with standardization, locals continue to adapt, remix, and teach the old games the old way by sitting down, rolling the dice, and letting the story unfold square by square. By the time the sun dips behind the barracks, the British officer has finally understood how a player re-enters the board after being captured. He smiles triumphantly and says, "It's all rather clever, isn't it?" You nod, but you also know he's only rolled the surface. You step away from the polished floors and labeled exhibits, following a dirt path that winds through dry fields and whispering groves. The land flattens out, and suddenly you're in the heart of rural India, where board games aren't preserved, they're lived. Here, amid the dust and mango trees, the games are still being played the way they always have been: improvised, animated, and a little bit chaotic. Welcome to cultural currents and forgotten fun. You approach a low stone wall where three grandmothers sit in the shade, slapping down cowrie shells onto a fabric board. One of them looks up, grins with all her teeth missing, and gestures for you to sit. Her granddaughter draws the game grid in the dirt with a stick, copying the layout from memory, every square placed with confidence, not hesitation. This isn't a museum piece. It's a living thing. The board may be traced in dust or drawn with rice flour during festivals, but the intent is as sharp as ever. A boy clutches pebbles as game pieces. The dice, not even cowries this time, just broken bangles and colored stones. Welcome to local rules, where everything's negotiable and nothing's written down. A mainstream, historical fact, despite urbanization and the spread of digital entertainment. Traditional Indian board games still survive in many villages across the subcontinent. Often passed orally through generations, they adapt to environment, context, and materials, yet maintain their essential form and purpose. You watch a game unfold between two elderly women. It's a hybrid of pachisi and snakes and ladders. The board is drawn with wet chalk on a flat stone slab. One player moves her piece forward and lands on a square labeled Chari, say envy. Down she slides. Shouldn't have spoken ill of your neighbor. The other cackles. It's part joke, part life lesson. Historians still argue whether this persistence is due to nostalgia or necessity. With limited access to commercial games or electricity, these traditional games thrive in places where self-made fun is not just preferable, it's essential. But others say it's more than practicality, it's about community, legacy, and rhythm. You ask a teenage boy how he learned the game he's teaching to younger kids. He shrugs. My uncle taught me. He said his grandfather taught him. There's no YouTube tutorial here. Just stories, gestures, and memory. The rules may shift from village to village, even from family to family, but the essence remains: play, challenge, connect. One particularly quirky example, in a small town in Gujarat, locals play a variant of Ashtapada, where each square represents a season, and certain moves are only allowed depending on the phase of the lunar calendar. You can't move diagonally during a full moon. Why? Because the moon messes with direction, says one elder, deadpan. Further south, in Tamil Nadu, a street festival erupts around a massive version of Giant Chopper drawn on the ground with colored sand. People take turns tossing dice and hopping through squares like a sacred game of hopscotch. Each virtue earns applause. Each vice, laughter and playful booze. It's a community spectacle, spiritual and silly all at once. In Kerala, a grandmother sets up a pachisi board during Onam. She's been embroidering the cloth all year, and this is its first outing. The pieces are carved jackfruit seeds, polished and dyed. She plays with her grandchildren, telling them which historical queens once used the same tactics. If you trap me here, I'll remember in the next round, she warns with a wink. You wander through more villages, each with its own flavor of the game. In Rajasthan, chopper is played with camel bones and sung instructions. In Bengal, children chalk snake and ladder boards onto school walls during breaks. In Maharashtra, temple walls feature murals of board games alongside mythological scenes. One small shrine even has a statue of Vishnu playing a dice game with Garuda. Locals say it brings good luck to trace the board pattern with your finger before making a wish. You try it. It feels oddly satisfying. You stop for tea at a dusty roadside stall and hear two old men debating a rule from a game they played 60 years ago. That square was always immunity, says one. No. The other insists, only during Shivratri. They agree to disagree. Then play another round. You realize something vital: these games are not frozen in the past. They're fluid, alive, carried not in books or exhibits, but in muscle memory, laughter, argument, and routine. As night falls, fireflies begin to flicker over the fields. You sit on the ground with a group of kids, playing a game with tokens made from dry beans and a board sketched in dust. The moon rises, the game continues, and somewhere between the toss of a bean and a small triumph on a square marked patience. You understand these games aren't forgotten. They've simply gone where cameras and scholars rarely follow, into the spaces where life unfolds slowly, joyfully, and face to face. A gust of warm wind tugs at your sleeve as you step out of the village and into something startlingly modern. Concrete buildings replace clay huts. The jingling of cowrie shells fades into the electronic chime of a smartphone. And yet, there's that familiar shape. An 8x8 grid glowing on a screen. A pawn slides forward. A bishop arcs diagonally. You've entered the era of modern games, ancient bones. You sit beside a teenager on a bus stop bench, his thumbs tapping away at a chess app. His focus is fierce. He's playing against someone in Brazil, he tells you, while on the way to math tuition. His profile picture is a laughing emoji with sunglasses. His strategy: aggressive openings, patient endings. And yes, he's currently in a 3-game win streak. You nod respectfully. Modern digital games are everywhere in India, from city cafes with Ludo tournaments to classrooms where snakes and ladders apps teach math and ethics. But look closely, you'll see the same DNA that ran through temple courtyards and royal balconies. The lines haven't vanished, they've just been lit by pixels. A mainstream historical fact: mobile versions of Pachisi, Chopper, and Snakes and Ladders have racked up millions of downloads in India. Ludo King, for instance, became a lockdown sensation, topping charts globally. And while the rules may be simplified and the pieces virtual, the emotional texture, luck, betrayal, triumph, is as ancient as ever. You watch a group of friends in a chai stall huddled around one phone. One swipes a dice roll, another yells, "You blocked me again?" Ladder erupts. They tease, they argue, they play on. It's Pachisi on a touchscreen, but it might as well be a marble courtyard in 1550. Historians still argue whether these modern iterations are meaningful continuations or just shallow echoes. Critics worry that something is lost when a handcrafted jackfruit seed token becomes a glowing square on a backlit display. Others say the digital versions keep the tradition alive, accessible, and evolving, especially for young people who might never see a real cowrie shell. You're invited into a cozy home where a grandmother and her granddaughter are playing Ludo, digital and analog versions side by side. The grandmother insists on the cloth board with hand-sewn squares. The granddaughter prefers her tablet. They play both. They laugh. They cheat a little. Tradition, it seems, is perfectly capable of running 2 operating systems. Quirky fact: in recent years, developers have begun embedding traditional Indian game mechanics into modern mobile RPGs and simulations. One indie game allows players to navigate karma-based ladders as part of a spiritual quest. Another builds turn-based strategy into temple politics during the Chola dynasty. The old is finding new skins. In a college dorm, you find a group of students developing a new take on Chopper. They've 3D printed tokens shaped like mythological animals and programmed an AI to simulate Shikoni's cursed dice tactics from the Mahabharata. They call it Dice of Dharma. It's both hilarious and deeply niche. You stroll into a bookstore and see board game kits with names like Gianpath and Ashtapada Reloaded. The packaging is slick, the colors vibrant, but inside, grids, ladders, tiny tokens. It's nostalgia meets reinvention, a cultural homecoming gift wrapped for Gen Z. Even the education sector has caught on. Some classrooms use simplified Gyan chopper boards to discuss moral decision-making. Teachers draw ladders for teamwork and snakes for dishonesty. Students play, and then reflect. One child says, "I got bitten by selfishness today." Another adds, "But tomorrow I'll climb kindness." You melt a little, and of course chess, ever the overachiever, stands tall. Indian grandmasters multiply by the year. Tournaments beam across YouTube with commentary that switches effortlessly between English, Hindi, and Tamil. You watch a 12-year-old dismantle a veteran strategy live. The crowd? Digital, global, and spellbound. But amid the modernity, something lingers. You visit a tech office where a digital design team keeps a worn Pachisi board pinned to the wall. Not for play, for reference. It reminds us of flow, one of them says. Of how elegant systems evolve from simple, intuitive rules. By the time evening falls, you sit by yourself, phone in hand. You tap open a game. The board appears, you move upon, you breathe, and in that quiet click of virtual dice, you hear echoes. The grandmother on the temple steps, the monk in saffron robes, the Mughal emperor watching human tokens march. Their fingers, their breaths, their stakes, all layered inside your screen, waiting for you to play your part. Because the format may change, the grid may glow, but the game never really leaves. You stretch your legs and step away from the screen, but the grid still lingers in your mind. Its neat symmetry, its tension and release. Now the scene blurs again, and you find yourself traveling beyond the Indian subcontinent entirely. Across oceans, deserts, mountains, following the footprints of migrating merchants, conquering armies, wandering monks, and curious sailors. You're tracing the diaspora of ideas, searching for chess's distant cousins. Your first stop, a windswept fjord in Viking Age Scandinavia. Inside a smoky longhouse, you spot a board game that looks suspiciously like Chaturanga's wild Norse cousin, Hanafatal. The grid is different. The pieces are fewer, but the core theme remains protect your king. The strategy is asymmetric, the tension universal. Did Indian game logic trickle up the Silk Road? Historians still argue whether this is direct lineage or parallel invention. You sit quietly and watch the patterns unfold, familiar in their foreignness. From there, you wander east to Korea. In a hillside village, you find children playing jangi, a variant of Chinese chess. It uses a 9x10 board, and the pieces have Chinese characters on them. The general sits inside a palace, and cannons leap over intervening pieces. A monk tells you this version was influenced by Xiangqi, itself descended from Shatranj. The DNA is unmistakable. Somewhere back in time, that grid was born of Indian strategy, filtered through Persian thought and Chinese elegance. A mainstream historical fact, the transmission of chess and similar board games across Eurasia is one of the best examples of cultural diffusion. From Chaturanga in India to Shatranji in Persia, to Shanki in China, to chess in Europe, the game adapted to fit local tastes while retaining its core hierarchy, war, and wit. And yet, the further you travel, the stranger the cousins become. In Thailand, you stumble upon Makruk, a chess variant that feels halfway between Shatranj and modern chess. The pawns can't double, step, and the queen, still called a seed, or nobleman, moves only one square at a time. It's as if Shatranj took a vacation and forgot to come home. Thai grandmasters defend the game's depth passionately. You're invited to play a round. You lose. It's humbling, also traditional. A quirky fact, in parts of Africa, particularly among the Yoruba of Nigeria, you find Io or Aware, Mancala type games involving seeds and pits. The logic is different, more about counting and redistribution than movement and capture. But the tactile intensity and strategic core feel akin to Pachisi. You flick a seed into a pit and suddenly understand every culture has its version of planning, of play, of pause, before the pounce. You cross into Russia and encounter Shakmati, their own fierce interpretation of chess, deeply embedded in Cold War legacy and modern sports culture. Soviet-era posters depict grandmasters as heroes, pieces as metaphors for labor and revolution. Chess is no longer a pastime. It's propaganda, performance, and national pride. You picture Chaturanga, humble and spiritual, blinking in disbelief. Meanwhile, in the Arab world, echoes of Shatranj still whisper in poetry. Ancient verses liken life's unpredictability to a game of chess, where kings fall and pawns rise. You read one aloud and catch a traveler smiling. He knows that line. So did his grandfather. In Spain, you encounter El Ajedrez, modern chess, but laced with Arabic roots. During the Moorish period, Shatranji boards found their way into Iberian courts. The Queen's movement, so limited in Shatranj, expanded dramatically during the late 15th century in Europe. Historians suggest this evolution paralleled the rise of powerful female monarchs. Coincidence? Maybe? Or maybe the board was keeping up with the times. You sip coffee in Istanbul and chat with a shopkeeper who recalls learning chess from his father, who learned it from a Sufi mystic. He taught me it's not about winning, the man says, but about understanding when to wait. Sounds familiar. And now, full circle, you sit on a Greek island porch and overhear tourists playing Ludo in the shade. One swears it was invented in Germany. Another says England. You smile quietly and whisper, "Try India." No one hears you, but the cowrie shells rattle faintly in your memory. Historians still argue whether all these games came from one ancestral source or emerged independently, inspired by the same human needs to simulate, to strategize, to socialize, to lose safely and win meaningfully. You don't need a clear answer. What you have now is a vast, glowing web of grids, tokens, rules, and rituals, stretching across centuries and civilizations. A shared language made not of words, but of moves, learned not in books, but in quiet afternoons and heated evenings. In every version, in every land, the board teaches. The game reveals, and whether you're a monk in Kanchipuram or a teenager in Kansas, the moment you place that first piece on a square, you are part of that old, ongoing conversation. You're back in India now, though not in a palace, temple, or bustling city. You're somewhere quieter. A village where electricity flickers in and out, where oxen walk the same dusty road every day, and where under the spreading arms of a neem tree, time seems to hold its breath. This is where it all started, and where it all continues. Welcome to Full Circle under the neem tree. Children, sit cross, legged on a checkered cloth, laid across the cracked earth. The pieces are smooth pebbles, sorted by size and weight. A grandmother watches, arms folded, occasionally correcting a move with a firm but gentle nudge. The cowrie shells clatter to the ground. Laughter erupts, and there it is, the oldest sound in gaming history, play without pretense. You squat beside them, unseen for now, and let the scene soak in. The rules are half remembered, half invented. One boy says you can jump squares if you hum a certain tune. A girl insists that stepping on your opponent's piece means you have to apologize and swap seats. No one questions her. That's just how it's done here. Historians still argue whether these hyper, local, often unwritten variations are modern inventions or ancient remnants. But does it matter? Whether it's new, old, or somewhere in between, the essence is unmistakably eternal play, learn, adapt, laugh, reset. A mainstream historical fact. Despite the dominance of global franchises like Monopoly or Call of Duty, traditional board games are seeing a quiet revival in parts of India. NGOs and educators are reintroducing them into rural schools, not just for recreation, but as tools for teaching math, ethics, and critical thinking. Because who needs flashcards when a Pachisi board can teach you probabilities and patience in the same breath? Nearby, two teenage girls paint a new game board on cardboard torn from a shipping box. One outlines the cross-shaped arms of Pachisi. The other draws snakes in pencil, and then paints ladders using dried marigold petals. They argue over where kinness should go. Eventually, they settle on a middle square. Not too early, one says. Not too late, says the other. You can't help but nod. A quirky tidbit in some villages. It's considered bad luck to finish a game too quickly. People purposely slow down near the end, stalling moves, drawing out suspense. Not to annoy, but to honor the game. After all, rushing ruins the rhythm. You watch as one child lands on a snake square. Pride. It's labeled in chalk, and slides down with dramatic flair. That's okay, his friend consoles him. Next time, choose humility. They both giggle. Philosophical resilience with a side of mischief. An elder joins the circle. She doesn't play. She just sits. Her eyes are cloudy with age, but she sees everything. When a rule is forgotten or contested, she speaks, not with authority, but with memory. Her voice is calm, patient, like someone who's played this game 1,000 times and learned it anew each time. As the sun lowers, casting golden spears through the neem leaves, the game nears its end. One token is a few squares from home. A perfect roll away. The shells fly. The child gasps. All four land open. 25, victory. But there's no whooping or table flipping. Just a shy smile, a round of soft applause. And then the cloth is shaken out. The pebbles gathered. The shells return to their pouch. The board disappears like a dream, folded into the dusk. You stay seated a moment longer, feeling the cool earth under your hands, the scent of neem, the laughter fading into firefly hum. And you realize these games aren't artifacts, they're rituals. repeated not for novelty, but for nourishment. A reminder that competition can be kind, that loss can teach, and that even the smallest move might carry centuries behind it. The grandmother catches your eye and smiles. Next round, you play, you smile back, and somewhere between then and now, between Ashtapada and apps, you understand the game never ends. It only pauses and waits for you to sit, to toss, to begin again.